Okay, it's 12:02, 17:02 in France. Welcome to and bienvenue to FACCNE's Life Science webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ludivine Wolksik, the Executive Director of the French-American Chamber of Commerce of New England, one of the leading French-American chambers in the US, a network of 6,000 members all over the country. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Alain Eudaric, founder and president of Ideas Pathways, for a valuable webinar on the fundamentals of decentralized trials. A seasoned life sciences and healthcare executive with experience working for several industry leading companies, including Parexel International, Thermo Fisher Scientific, and Kearney, Alain has over 20 years of international experience in pharma and life sciences. His fields of expertise include program leadership, clinical operations, alliance management, strategic planning, M&A, growth and innovation, supply chain leadership, and process improvement. He has an impressive list of diplomas from French and American universities, including Johns Hopkins and Purdue universities, Harvard Medical School, and he also holds an MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management. A member of Beth Israel Deaconess Needham Board of Advisors, Alain was recently elected on the board of directors of the FACCNE, and he serves on the French-American Biotech Springboard, better known as the FABS, which is the team of experts that serves at the Life Science Forum and Healthcare for FACCNE. Alain, we are very proud to have you on our team. The presentation today will be around 40 minutes long, with the possibility for everybody to ask questions and comments in the chats or the Q&A. And we'll also have a few minutes left after the presentation for questions. Alain, with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludivine. Let me share my my desktop. Can everybody see the screen at this point?
Yes, we are good.
Okay, thank you. So in this presentation today, Fundamentals of Decentralized Clinical Trials, we will discuss key principles and elements involved in those studies. The webinar is designed as an introductory overview of select issues, considerations, and important market evolutions as companies, biotech or pharmaceutical companies, incorporate such decentralized aspect in their toolkit in order to obtain more effective development programs beyond the pandemic disruptions after this COVID-19 era. So moving on to the second slide. Essentially, let's start with some semantics for clinical trials. There's a vast array of wording and definitions that has been used to designate the decentralized clinical trials, as you can see on the left-hand side. Some with the same meaning, some with slightly different meanings depending on the context. On the left, you can see virtual clinical trials, remote clinical trials, patient-centric trials, or hybrid models, with this last term highlighting a mix of operations between traditional clinical trials and the new model. One important distinction to make here is that I'm talking about real patients in this presentation, that is physical human beings, as opposed to the term virtually being used sometimes for a machine simulated patient. That's not what we're talking about here. Also, I used the Pharma Association definition in the presentation that you can see on the right-hand side at the top of the screen. So a decentralized trial is a trial where all or some aspects traditionally completed in the clinic are performed outside of traditional clinical centers remotely and using digital technology to facilitate some of the activities. So as you can tell from the definition, it highlights the two main characteristics of decentralized clinical trials. One, there's something done remotely that was traditionally done at a medical center. And two, there are aspects that are facilitated through digital technology. Examples of the remote and digital activities in the trials include patient recruitment activities, patient-informed consent, patient visits like telehealth or patient communication, management of the drugs or the investigational medicinal product when you ship medication directly to a patient home, for instance, or work location sometimes. And perhaps in other examples would be reported outcomes and data collections. In other words, what happens in terms of study impact for the patients. Before going too far into details, it is important to ask, in my view, why such changes are considered. In other words, why look at clinical trials at all? Essentially, the decentralized aspect offer the potential for improved patient recruitment, improved satisfaction and retention of those patients, which has been a major plague or major issues for traditional clinical trials, especially in terms of cost and study delays. On a related note, and perhaps more importantly, these decentralized aspects offer the potential to complete clinical trials faster, which has a very, very significant impact for industry sponsors. Some of those approaches, though, have been around for a long time. For instance, Pfizer is traditionally credited with the first fully virtual clinical study, as back as 2011, the remote studies, which was an all-electronic home-based study, and that was designed to assess the safety and efficacy of a compound called a drug called Decentralized. And the inception date of hybrid studies go back even several years earlier with companies like Lilly doing such studies. So, we're really talking about solutions that have existed for 10 to 20 years, depending on the model you're talking about. So why at this point, why now? Well, the COVID pandemic certainly played a role. There are many statistics available on clinical trials disruptions for as a result of COVID. So I just picked a couple that you see on the bottom left of the slide. Sorry. For instance, there were over 2,000 studies that were stopped due to COVID. And those represented over close to about 800 unique drugs and biologics, according to that same source. Actually, the exact figure I found on that reference was 788. Another data point I found interesting was the second bullet at the bottom there, that it talks about oncology, which has traditionally been by far the top therapeutic area for the in the industry pipeline in terms of trial counts. In other words, in terms of the number of clinical studies happening in the industry. And if you look at the oncology trial launches, people have seen a reduction of 60%, so more than half in study launches. So that is quite significant for the top industry therapeutic area. And on a related note, if we go back to these 2,000 studies example that I mentioned, oncology seemed to have a smaller proportion of studies stopped due to COVID than traditionally. Essentially, about 1 out of 5 studies were stopped in oncology versus historically about 1 out of 3 in a comparative sample. In any case, the impact of the pandemic also included those reduction in trial launches in addition to studies being stopped. And these does not even count the trial delays, which I've seen estimated at around 80% of clinical trials based on surveys conducted shortly after the COVID crisis started. So I think that the data was back in in April or June. Needless to say, so COVID has caused major disruptions for the industry. As a result, decentralized solutions have suddenly appeared as a lot more attractive as means to salvage or rescue clinical trials in the era of social distancing. In addition, regulatory agencies have made corresponding allowances for such approaches to be used. You can see on the screen on the right-hand side at the bottom corner, a screen copy of the March 2020 FDA guidance that was issued during the pandemic. Given the expected benefits, though, the increased industry acceptance, and the increased willingness of sponsors to use virtual study elements, as well as additional upcoming guidance, the regulatory guidance that is expected, I would say and I would expect that decentralized clinical trials should be here to stay. Let me move to the next slide. There we go. So how should one think about decentralized clinical trials at a more granular level? And DCT stands for Decentralized Clinical Trials on top of the slide. So there's a plethora of a la carte options, and sorry for using the gastronomy analogy here, but I thought it would be suitable for this. You can see the menu items, so to speak, organized into four somewhat empirical categories on top of the slide between the between patients, investigators, clinical operations, and study documentations. And generally speaking, the pandemic has pushed clinical trial professionals to take a long, hard look at study requirements and perhaps leave their natural historical comfort zone, so to speak. And this in turn has resulted in streamlined approaches that leverage some of the items on this menu. While I will not cover each menu item in detail, let me do a quick walkthrough of these. So starting in the first column with the study feasibility, there are a number of approaches and techniques these days around patient data mining approaches that can be used to evaluate the impact of inclusion-exclusion criteria to build an appreciation for the ease and speed of recruitment and potentially adapt the study protocol to reflect that learning. E-recruitment relates to the remote recruiting approaches from wider and more diverse patient population than traditional clinical sites. Science 37 is a typical example of companies that offer such recruitment options. And e-recruitment can be done using a variety of web-based methods that can include social media, patient portals, and telemedicine applications. Importantly, it also leverage patient medical information sources, and you can see also partnerships with clinical data providers for hospitals, for instance. E-consent uses various electronic media to provide information about the clinical study to the patient to make sure they're aware of all the aspects and risks related to the study, and then obtain and document their informed consent as required by clinical trial regulations. Decentralized clinical trials can also use digital technology, as you see at the bottom of that square, to train and engage patients in the study. Such technologies are also used to manage various scheduling aspects sometimes. Now, switching to the second menu category, there are a number of decentralized trial options aimed at managing investigators, or even engaging them or rallying them as potential investigators for a clinical study. They typically correspond to the various phases of clinical trials, from site selection to agreement and contract management, to study initiation, to engagement and documentation or training. So now let's look at the third category, trial operations. Shipping drugs to patients can be quite complex and probably requires careful consideration of the clinical trial protocols, workflows, as well as privacy and safety requirements. Should think about safety, drug storage requirements, blinding requirements, regulations around patient privacy, and drug regimen, for instance. So said differently, the information about the patient should not be accessible to everybody, and should, for instance, when a courier is involved, should be the retention of that information should be minimized. While virtual visits are a simple concept, to take another item on that list, there are critical aspects to consider. For instance, the approach should protect patient privacy and safety. In addition, the approach needs to preserve the data quality and integrity as required for the clinical study. Third, the various stakeholders need to be trained, something that can be easily forgotten, unfortunately. In practice, these virtual visits can use a range of different applications, including live video conferencing, remote patient monitoring, as well as asynchronous video conferencing or data entries. There's something similar essentially to when you go to a doctor's office and you fill out forms and information before you see a doctor. Virtual visits can certainly gain acceptance with a widespread adoption of telehealth, for instance, in the US during the pandemic, along with the willingness of the CMS Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and private insurers to pay for such visits. Similarly, whereas patients in the past were required to perform lab procedures at a clinical center only, the pandemic has opened to the door for more flexible approaches, especially for routine testing that can be performed at home or via a local laboratory. This is captured in the list under the item called Remote Lab at the bottom of the third column. Clinical outcome assessment in that same column is the ability to remotely measure what is happening, and that is an important component of decentralized clinical trials. Such approaches require careful selection and validation of the devices involved, the provision of instructions for patient and site, the adequate training and compliant use of the devices for applicable regulations such as HIPAA, 21 CFR Part 11, GDPR in Europe, just to name a few. Lastly, depending on the protocol, virtual home support options might be required to support the patient for the clinical study. That's another bullet you see there. And the last category captures various aspects, on the right-hand side, capture various aspects related to study data collection and documentation to ensure that data and documents generated from the study are captured remotely in an efficient way, taking advantage of available technology solutions. Now, it's important that not every clinical trial, or not all clinical trials, are created equal. And when you look at these a la carte options for decentralized clinical trials, not all of them are appropriate for every clinical trials. And I would say not even for every geography considered for a single clinical trial, depending on the regulations in particular. So when evaluating those a la carte menu options for clinical trials, to continue the analogy, I think about the dietary requirements to consider as fourfold: safety, quality, informatics, and leadership, as you can see from the slide, this SQL framework. And I will provide more details on each part of this SQL framework on the following slides. And I will keep referring to the menu items at the top of the slides, sorted by category: patients, investigators, clinical operations, and trial documentation. Sorry, moving to the next slide. Here we go. So patient safety is is the first dimension of that framework. And for first category of that framework, sorry. And as you can tell from the graphic on the top right corner, there are several dimensions to take into account for this category. Our patients are selected, initially. Our study performance is monitored. How adverse events are managed, ensuring compliance with regulatory mandates for the applicable geographies in the clinical study, incorporating guidelines and best practices relevant for the intervention, therapeutic area, or the study. As you select those DCT options in the menu and approach from the a la carte, you really need to examine how this might affect each of these safety dimensions. Just as a rule of thumb, though, interventions will well-establish safety profiles and adverse event profiles that can be monitored, let's say, entirely based on laboratory data or wearable technologies, as opposed to interventions where physical interpretation of other clinical data might be required. Those more simpler studies are more suited to a more fully decentralized approach. Similarly, more invasive procedures or trials requiring a much higher clinician oversight might be less conducive to a fully decentralized approach, which is not to say that the hybrid approaches could not be used in such cases, however. And even for the more challenging safety profiles, there might still be opportunities to leverage local medical centers or remote options for such assessment, to use alternative assessment methods and composition, or to adjust the frequency of in-person assessments at clinical centers. There are particular number of approaches that have been defined for oncology in that respect that follow those principles. Patient safety is the in the words of the FDA, is paramount. It's the most important part of the framework, aligning with the Code of Federal Regulations, as you see on the slide, sections 21, CFR 50, protection of human subjects, 56, institutional review boards, 312, investigational new drugs, 314, application for approval, and 600 biologics, as illustrated by the various bullets on the slide. The tool needs to fit the, what I would say in addition in terms of those, the many options is that the tool needs to fit the study and not the reverse. So for instance, eligibility criteria should be scientifically and ethically justified rather than driven by specific technology solutions. So it always comes back to classical concepts around safety. E-consent needs to meet local regulatory mandates and reflect the records that will be kept, for instance, after seeing a local physician, for instance, rather than any clinical site physician. And suitable process is required for identity validation. In other words, you need to make sure the person that signed the consent is the right person. As part of the IRB approval process, one of the consideration that is required is to ensure a representative population. And as one example, having talked to colleagues in the industry, some pharma companies have, for instance, elected to have a portfolio of smartphones that they can send to patients that need them to be able to participate in a clinical study, so that there is no technical hurdle around having representative populations participate. And in fact, one might argue that certain e-recruitment approaches offer the potential to reach more diverse patient population and thus result in a more representative patient mix in terms of that IRB process. There are also common sense aspects to running effectively those decentralized clinical trials, as you can see here, such having a virtual part precede an in-person assessment, and not the reverse. In order to effectively manage adverse events from patient safety perspective, again, Easily accessible clinical decision support should be defined with any remote monitoring option, along with risk assessments and adverse event preventions. As a particular example, study coordinator having need to be easily accessible at any point, rather than having to force patient to wait for on-site appointment, for instance. Similarly, appropriately licensed clinicians need to be available to qualify the safety events. So the same way you would have those considerations for traditional clinical studies, you need to translate that into the context of a virtual study or decentralized clinical study. Lastly, one needs to think through the feasibility and validity of digitally transmitted data. And that can vary from by geography as well. So that's a combination of validation and regulatory authority considerations. So this concludes the patient safety perspective. Let me move to the second part of the SQIL framework, quality. I would actually refer you to a useful framework for this purpose made available by the Association of CROs that can guide through the various quality dimensions for clinical trials. It is available from the organization website at acrohealth.org, acrohealth.org. In a nutshell, what this is about is the need to ensure that the decentralized approach you select is appropriate for all operational aspects associated with the clinical trials, and for each geography as well, and that you have defined appropriate mitigation approaches for each of the salient risks for the study. The various dimensions are listed on the slide next to the image that you see in the center of the slide. And let me pick a few illustrative points for this. At a holistic IT and system level, a decentralized clinical trial approach needs to rest on well-defined, well-understood systems, processes, data flows, and exchange norms. So the approach needs to be regulatory compliant, practical, available for the stakeholders in each of the geographies, and realistic for the patient and clinicians considered for the study. For trial planning and design, the selection made from the a la carte menu we saw need to be well understood from a technical, from a data management, from a safety, and from a regulatory perspectives. Understanding how the menu option impact traditional approaches and might vary by geography is important to address potential gaps or implementation roadblocks that you may not have otherwise. One way to effectively do this and think through this is by engaging the various clinical trial stakeholders early on, and which might help smooth out a new approach that has not been tested before or used before very often, and uncover potential difficulties. And again, depending on the geography, some regulatory consultation might be required. You know, there are some countries that expect some consultation when you use such innovative approaches. The clinical protocol for the study should reflect the menu options you've selected. There are a number of sections in that protocol that might be affected by the approach, and particularly the risk mitigation aspects, then data collections, drug management aspects, and so on. So it's important to capture the impact of those aspects in the clinical trial protocol and explain what is happening, how, under what format, and so on. The study monitoring and management approach appropriate for the decentralized approach also needs to be established, and you should expect to cover aspects such as wearable data access for the various stakeholders when use different tools than for traditional studies, aspects such as data privacy. For instance, how do you ensure data privacy for the study? The next dimension is concerns trial supplies. In other words, investigational medicinal products for the study. This is or non-investigational medicinal products for comparators and whatnot. So this is a multi-dimensional category in and of itself, combining different stakeholders between couriers, clinical sites, drug depots, manufacturers, patients, and there are many regulatory, manufacturing, and safety considerations to take into account. So it's probably this might be just a presentation by itself. So I won't go into too many details, but suffice to say that there is a lot of considerations to take into account when shipping drugs to patients, including return and destructions of drugs when things are not used, or when a patient drops off a protocol, having a ramp down of medication as needed by the protocol and so on. So last but not least, there are many documentation aspects that need to be taken into account throughout the study life cycle, covering ongoing access during planning, execution, closure, and after archiving a clinical study. Each a la carte menu option typically comes with additional data documentation required. Next, you also need to ensure that you have suitable resources to conduct the various virtual study aspects. For instance, when conducting a virtual visit in the US, you need to ensure, unless you have specific waiver, you need to ensure adequate state licensure for the clinicians, for the remote study clinicians, in addition to other just simple resourcing considerations. So during the COVID era, there were waivers obtained for consultations, but in a regular course of decentralized clinical studies, those might not be available. Last but not least, as you define different processes and approaches from traditional studies, you also need to ensure that you can still detect and document any protocol deviation. So that completes the quality part of the SQL framework. Let's move to the third component, informatics. So once companies move beyond the pandemic, they will need to think through a more proactive approach on which technologies they wish to implement for decentralized clinical trials and how this will impact their various stakeholders and processes. As you can tell from the graphic on the screen, there are quite different modalities to approach that informatics part, from simply purchasing the service or technical solution on a case-by-case basis, to developing in-house capabilities, to participating in industry collaborations, to making selected investments in some of the providers, to the outright acquisition of the technical capabilities. One of the challenges that the companies have to tackle at this point is the relatively fragmented market for decentralized clinical trial informatics without a unique and fully established standards that would apply across the board. As might be deemed somewhat typical of a fast evolving technology business, this is both a technical and a geographical issue at this point. As recent industry surveys have shown, from the industry, though, is eager to increase the use of decentralized clinical trials. The regulatory bodies appear willing to facilitate the development. The usage of informatic tools and approaches should become more prominent as a result to support the many options for decentralized clinical trials. So this has helped in the industry. This has helped the emergence of new innovative clinical trial solution providers for many of the menu items we've seen. So a lot of new players, or relatively new players, I should say. Example of the technologies include if you recall the first category of the menu of a la carte menu, the patient management solutions corresponding to that first column. Typical solutions in that category facilitate access to more diversified patient pools and facilitate the remote execution of clinical trials at home, as well as local provider support. This often includes the use of artificial intelligence and access to patient data to identify and target patients more likely to qualify for the clinical trials, given the inclusion and exclusion criteria used. And these capabilities can also serve as design tool, as I mentioned earlier, to optimize the clinical trial protocol. If you think about the critical success factors in that arena, they include understanding of the therapeutic area to be able to translate the protocol requirements into effective patient targeting, the access to patient medical information from the various geographies involved, and ideally, longer term, the ability to improve the adequation between the prospective patient information that is available and the typical study targeting requirements. Such solutions also need the flexibility and expertise to tackle the evolving and diverse regulatory requirements around patient information, patient management across the various geographies for the study. Now, thinking about the second category of the a la carte menu, investigator management solutions. Typical solution in that category facilitate the participation of physicians and sites in clinical trials, allowing industry sponsors to access a wider net of investigators with corresponding patient pools, or to more effectively manage the investigator they already have. Here again, it might be helpful to have a broader and geographically diverse access and a strong understanding of the needs specific to a therapeutic area of interest. So at least for the intervention that are more conducive to a decentralized approach. Third category of the menu, clinical trial operations. This is an area that is still relatively fragmented. And while there are many point solutions that have been defined, for instance, for remote monitoring, for wearables, for remote visit apps, or for simply study-specific approaches, there is further progress to be made to get consistent regulatory compliant approaches with validated digital biomarkers, as well as a clear connectivity and data standards across all clinical trial geography. The current lack of definition has limited the momentum of such solutions for clinical trials. In addition, the fact that a device is approved does not necessarily mean that it can be used for the purpose of your clinical studies. Parexel has done a study recently on that showed that to be critical consideration, for instance. So the critical factors for solution and service providers in that arena include regulatory understanding for the various geographies, the ability to evaluate, standardize, and validate data from the various devices to deliver regulatory compliant information, as well as the ability to define, use, and leverage digital biomarkers for the relevant therapeutic area. In that clinical trial operations category, perhaps one area that's interesting to note is, and that has made more progress, relates to the first bullet that we had in this category, which is essentially direct-to-patient drug shipments. Solutions for that part would typically be an add-on to the overall study approach, facilitating the management of supply chain and drug logistics in conjunction to study randomization needs and study forecasting. An example of a relatively newer provider in that space is 4G Clinical that was founded in 2015, so about 5 years ago. So the last column, the clinical trial documentation part of the menu. This is an area aimed mostly at efficiency and compliance, although there are different aspects built, for instance, around artificial intelligence and real-world evidence, real-world data mining, and One thing I would say around this real-world evidence is that it's still a work in process. There are a number of regulatory and approach limitation in terms of retrospective versus forward-looking, and however, still bears watching longer term. Coming back to the efficiency and compliance piece, though, a perfect solution example is in that space is the electronic trial master files, or ETMF in short, which consists in capturing study data and maintaining inspection readiness and compliance. Example of providers in that space include Medidata and Viva, for instance. A final solution worth mentioning here is that the case of the companies that attempt to provide services and solution platforms that allow for the integration of various emerging industry solutions, sparing the sponsors from the challenges associated with cobbling together the different point solution, different parts together. And the key for those providers is to provide a fast, efficient, easily scalable and repeatable way of integrating those individual solutions. So that, sometimes people talk about platform providers. There are also CROs that have invested in the ability to manage the technology offerings. Although as you can tell from this discussion, the right informatics method may not always appear straightforward. There are, however, some basics to cover, as indicated in the slide, irrespective of the approach retained. Investigator and study personnel need to be trained. You need to have thought through the various workflows and disruption contingencies. Different regulatory requirements for the various clinical trial geographies need to be accommodated. And aspects such as digital security, privacy, blinding, and other data monitoring committee considerations need to be taken care of. So let's move to the next slide. So as you can tell from the safety data, quality and informatics slides, this is a very complex and changing environment, which brings me to this fourth part of this SQL framework. Leadership to make sense of it all and adapt to the new normal after the COVID pandemic. One first obvious aspects where leadership comes into play is dealing with the aftermath and the results of the various disruptions and band-aid solutions used to cope with the short-term realities of the COVID environment, as we saw in the initial slides, and all these disruptions and delays. In parallel, companies will need to adapt to an evolving multidimensional environment, namely new technologies and service solutions for new suppliers, as was discussed in the informatics slide, evolving regulatory framework and guidance in the various geographies. Unfortunately, this is not a uniform picture. In Europe, for instance, there are variations from country to country. As an example, various ongoing clinical trial transformation and industry initiatives are underway or continuing. Just to name a couple, Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, Translate, and others, something I'll come back to in a later slide, actually. There's also the potential for evolving business model brought about by these new players and evolving offerings. So in other words, people may have to change the way they procure the services or the way they engage those supply chain partners. And last but not least, there's a need to evolve clinical trial teams and processes at biotech and pharma companies to address aspects specific to decentralized studies and tools and processes. So depending on the company internal expertise and resources, it might be helpful to leverage CROs or external consultants that might have a stronger domain knowledge or wider experience with various emerging industry solutions, or that have built framework and processes that can be used across different sponsors. As the decentralized clinical trials gain importance, you can expect additional positioning from these industry providers. As just one example that came around last week, PPD just issued a press release this last week that indicated they had been recognized by ISG for the industry leadership in digital and decentralized clinical trial solutions. So I would seriously expect more of these positioning to come along the way. In any case, such expertise and leadership will be required to establish and refine a development strategic approach, management processes, as well as architecture frameworks to effectively manage the various remote and digital approaches encompassed in decentralized clinical trials. So at this stage, under the auspices of the leadership we just covered, companies and stakeholders have indicated different predominant strategic considerations, with the ultimate goal, as you see on the top right corner of the slide, to size the expected benefits from decentralized clinical trials in the form of faster execution, improved patient access and retention, streamline operating costs, and preserve study powers from a data management perspective. So strategic considerations I've typically included, from what I've seen, if you look at the left side of the slide, the ability to conduct more resilient clinical operations. So this is kind of the syndrome, never again. I've been injured this time around by COVID. I don't want this to happen again. I want a more resilient trial operation approach that won't be disrupted by the next pandemic. So learning from past pains is maybe one of the dominant aspects of that approach. On the right-hand side, the innovative technology, there's a strategic consideration to include the ability to more consistently and rapidly use innovative technology solutions that can effectively and efficiently improve upon current clinical trials performance. In the past, the pharma industry have been arguably hesitant to adopt newer technologies, but I think one change that has been at least communicated or expressed interest in is this ability to evolve faster. Last, but certainly not least, the other strategic consideration that has been arguably more widely used is the ability to focus on patients more effectively to improve related aspects such as patient recruitment, patient retention, patient compliance, and patient satisfaction. As a side comment, this patient centricity approach typically figures as a dominant decentralized clinical trial advantage when you look at industry surveys. So there are other considerations, of course, that you can build, but those are the three mainstream ones I've seen in the expressed in the industry at this point. So now moving on to the next section of the presentation, I wanted to highlight a few of the recent industry developments that point to further changes ahead in transforming the clinical trial industry following the increased usage of those decentralized clinical trials. So first, a new industry association. So we talked about earlier industry association and their influence. This one was created 3 months ago. You see the inception date of December 10th, 2020, to accelerate the adoption of decentralized clinical trials. The Decentralized Trial and Research Alliance, or DTRA in short, in this case. It is important to also note on their mission the patient centricity emphasis that we just discussed. As explained in the December 10th initial press release by DTRA, the Alliance plans to unite stakeholders, including healthcare companies, regulators, patient groups, and research organizations, with a mission to make clinical trial participation widely accessible by advancing policies, research practices, and new technologies in decentralized clinical research. So you see really a more holistic approach that involves very different stakeholders. And as you can tell from the numerous logo on the slides, DTRA is currently composed of over 80 life science and healthcare organizations that consist of many recognizable organizations, including the FDA, top pharma companies and key decentralized clinical trial solution providers. So in addition to the DTRA association creation and launch, there are significant financial investment that were made in companies that offer decentralized clinical trial services and solutions, serving as a leading indicator in my view of changes and innovations to come. So just looking at the selected clipping on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see investments in excess of 200 million over 4 companies in less than 6 months. And this does not include the investments made by the various biotech and pharma companies to adopt decentralized clinical trial approaches. The thread press release, for instance, for the $50 million cash infusion, mentioned the significant progress made over the past years to build these decentralized clinical trial capabilities, including expanding global footprint over 40 countries, pandemic risk mitigation tools, and global multilingual support. Science 37, to take another example, with its cash infusion of 40 million, mentioned that they will use this new capital to support their rapid growth, expand their technology platform, and accelerate their global expansion efforts, further strengthening their ability to have sponsor execute decentralized studies, enable patients from anywhere. So let's just take a quick third example. The Medable one for 31 million mentioned they need more transformative technologies that break down barriers to improve patient access, experience, and outcomes. And the new funding will enable them to continue to pursue newer technologies that improve clinical trials to benefit all patients. So there is definitely a theme here that you can detect around broader, more global patient access, as well as expanding offering, which points out to newer capabilities and services to be expected. On a related note, as a sign of changing times, the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development is conducting a global study in collaboration with the Gates Medical Research Institute on remote teams managing clinical research activities. The intent is to identify trends and key practices as well as baseline data to evaluate future evolutions. I have included the information and language approved by their IRB on the slide. Would you be interested in participating in this survey? Please note that the participant will receive a summary of the results. So for those that work in the industry, this is a chance to get involved directly and to learn more from the summary results you would be receiving. The FACCNE team is posting a copy of the link in the chat for everyone if that's not already done, if you wish to participate and easily copy the link. So finally, this presentation leverages a wide variety of sources on decentralized clinical trials, in addition to the sources that were listed on the individual slides. The list on the screen is a selection of pertinent articles that were used as background for my presentation. So even though decentralized clinical trial approaches are not new by any stretch of the imagination, as we discussed, almost all of these references were published in the last 2 years, which again emphasizes the fast-changing environment of decentralized clinical trials. One additional point that might bear mentioning, by the way, is that not all references paint a fully satisfactory view of decentralized clinical trials. You can see the second reference, for instance, that mentioned 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Nevertheless, the more recent publications tend to have favorable views. So I realize I went really fast and covered a lot of grounds in a short time. Would you have further questions or need follow-up after this meeting? This is my email contact information. And without further ado, I will stop here.
Thank you, Alain. We have one question for you from Nicola Schmitz. Any example of cryptocurrency use in DCT?
So I have read about cryptocurrencies being used, but I've personally not seen, not witnessed any specific examples myself. So let me take this as as an action item to get back to you. But I have not personally seen it in use yet.
Okay, thank you.
I've seen it. The cases where I've seen it mentioned were more related to site payments as opposed to investigate to patient compensation. So I'm not sure which part of your question this referred to actually.
Thank you, Alain. We have a few, thank you note telling your presentation is excellent and very comprehensive. We do have another question that just popped up. With trials moving toward a decentralized approach, what is your perspective, and or what do we already know about how decentralized trials impact patient compliance to medications?
So the surveys I've seen in that respect, or the data points that I've seen, the experiments that has been published, have tended to provide in a more anecdotal fashion the fact that the patient compliance has been usually improved as a result of the decentralized approach, in that typically the patient, the approaches used in decentralized clinical trials have been more patient-centric and have made it easier for patients to comply with the clinical study. So when well used and well designed, a decentralized clinical trial approach would be expected to improve patient compliance.
Okay. And I have another question in the chat. Will HCPs and CROs still be fully responsible for documenting CRFs and protocol information, or will we rely more on the patients and caregivers?
So again, that is it's a relatively, the case report forms and all those aspects is a relatively straightforward question. The difficulty in answering it, though, is the lack of regulatory guidance around some of the new sources of information. So typically the sponsors and in their name, the CROs are still responsible for the information captured as part of the study documentation and in anything reflected in trial master file. This might or might not evolve as sources of information are added, and as those approaches are validated. So in other words, there are a number of aspects that could become their own validations, arguably, but this is more of a working process and certainly not uniform in terms of solutions at this point. But this is something the industry has been working on and investigating. So I would expect some changes that try to minimize the burden of duplication and therefore might streamline some of those responsibilities as a result.
Thank you, Alain. So it's close to 1 p.m., so we are going to end the sessions here. Thank you so much for sharing your comprehensive expertise. We put Alain's contact information in the chat if you'd like to reach out to him directly, alain.eudaric@ideopathways.com. To learn more about FACCNE's upcoming program, we invite you to visit our website at faccne.org. Thanks again, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.